go off in the bush, and all of a sudden you run into this little group of people they call Negrillos. How did they get there? You go to Guam, and you find a little group of people called Chimoros, little Moors. How did they get there? You go into Vietnam, and you find these black people in Vietnam. How did they get there? How did the people get on the island of Fiji? How did they get to Australia? How did they get to Mexico and Central America before Columbus? You see, so the question of the movement, you see, the image of African people as movers on their own independent steam is not a part of the picture that we painted of African people. But it's counter to the fact, because the fact is that African people were the first migrants in the first place.
You're listening to some of the sounds of Africa from Brazil, Tobago,
it's a long time coming, never see you. Come, let me hold your hand.
and in America. Now we want you to see some of the sons and daughters of Africa in Russia, in the Philippines, and in the royal history of England. Some of these faces and places might surprise you. That's because most of our history books and many of our educators want you to believe that Africans only left Africa because of European slavery. Nothing could be further from the truth.
No people ever migrated as much as Africans. When Eric the Red went into Iceland, he found black people. He reported it. The Vikings found blacks among them, Thorhall the hunter, Thorstein. Africans among the Vikings. When the Romans attacked Britain, they found Africans. They said there were people as dark as Ethiopians among the fair-skinned Britons.
But more than that, if Africans had not left their continent of origin, Europeans, Asians, and the entire world's population would not exist.
This is one way that our thinking has changed over the years, that we used to think that we had to explain why it is that blacks are black. Well, now we realize that it makes perfectly good sense for people who live in Africa to be black, and what we need to explain is why are whites white.
As we discussed in part 3 of this series, the first Africans, who were also the first people, began to populate Europe and the rest of the world thousands of years ago as Homo erectus. During segment 3 of this video series, we also explained items number 1 and 2 of Dr. Hilliard's 10 points in African history. Those migrations, starting with Homo erectus, is an era we'll call the first wave of African migrations. It essentially planted humanity. For the second major wave of African migration, we must move forward several thousand years to the Egyptian Empire. According to Dr. Hilliard and Dr. Van Sertima, the people of Kemet, which we know by its Greek name Egypt, held the Khoikhoi of southern Africa in high esteem. Modern science tells us these Khoikhoi, or San people, were the world's first Homo sapiens sapiens, or modern men. The Kemites also claim they came from the Mountains of the Moon, either an area near Uganda or Kenya. Dr. Ivan Van Sertima says it's an idea that now has some scientific support.
We had thought, and Chancellor Williams and even I had said in our books, that it's an Afro-Asiatic language. Now we have proof beyond any question that the Egyptian language is not Afro-Hamitic or Afro-Asiatic or Afro-Semitic or Afro-anything. It is fundamentally African. Those elements that came in later from other places and other peoples, those are surface elements, lexical elements, words here and there, which comes into every language, and they have nothing to do with the fundamental grammatical structure of Egyptian language, which is African.
Egypt also brings us to the third wave of African migration. This took place in and around the 25th dynasty and probably during the reign of this man, Taharqa. Now, before we tell you about the migration, let's talk about the people. It's important to remember that the country of Egypt is in Africa. Its original people were Africans. They described themselves as black and were described as having black skin and woolly hair by noted Greeks and Romans. Any doubts about their racial heritage can be removed by looking at these stone photographs. You can also see some of the same faces in Mexico.
The Olmec heads are kind of an embarrassment in that they widely and for a long time been recognized as looking black. They don't look like the typical, like we've all seen these Aztec figures with the long noses and very hatchet-faced people. The Olmec heads, on the other hand, are sort of wide and oblong and with flat noses and thick lips and you know, very black looking.
How do you explain them getting there?
I don't.
Dr. Van Sertima says the ancient Africans sailed to the New World in boats such as these. Built of reed, able to hold more than 50 people, they could move incredibly fast.
The catamaran in the Pacific, they have found these jointed canoes, which are not really canoes. The canoe is a misnomer, jointed boats that were extremely sturdy, far sturdier than the Asiatic boats. And they found one of them with 48 men, 24 rowing, 24 resting, which could cross so fast it could move from Puerto Rico to Venezuela in a single day. Africa has two of the longest rivers in the world, the Nile and the Niger. They spent more time on those waters than they spent on other roads. They had about 12 types of ships on the Niger, not even counting the Nile, which had 3,000 years of shipbuilding. It gave its ideas to the Phoenicians, who were the great navigators of the early world. You find, for example, on the Indian Ocean, the Mughals of India were so impressed by African ideas about the sea and their ships that they made them admirals of the Indian Ocean, of people known as the cities, and African seagoing people were made admirals of the Indian Ocean by the Mughals of India. The Chinese report Africans were bringing elephants to them in ships to the court of China 2 centuries before Columbus. You can't take elephants across the Indian Ocean in a dugout.
But the Africans of Egypt's last cultural dynasty also sailed the seas in smaller vessels such as these, a feat Atlanta cardiologist Dr. Arthur Lee knows about personally.
Abu Bakr had made the crossing probably 1311 with a fleet of 400 ships. He was a king in Mali, and there were other voyages who made it earlier. If you're from, say, Spanish Sahara, you have to get out offshore about 100 miles to get into the region of the Northeast trades. When I made the trip, I started out from the Canary Islands, and we were in Grand Canary. We left in the evening, about 4 hours sailing time, heading due south. We picked up the Northeast trades, and we carried them all the way right into the Caribbean. It's a real easy trip. Take it some time.
Doctors Lee and Van Sertima say these African travelers were able to catch cross currents in the Atlantic to bring them back and forth. Dr. Van Sertima also says certain types of plants, which were a hybrid of North American and African origin, grew in Africa before Columbus came. These plants further support the world travel theory. And then there's the matter of maps.
What is extraordinary about this map is that it shows the correct latitudinal and longitudinal coordinates between the African Atlantic coast and American Atlantic coast. Two other things are very extraordinary about it, that it's only 1 degree off from modern maps. No map produced in Europe before the space age has that accuracy. And 150 years after Columbus, nobody could have produced such a map because it is recorded in encyclopedias of Europe that longitude had not been discovered and was undiscoverable. That is as late as 150 years after Columbus. What this map does is that it shows the Atrato River in Colombia mapped accurately. Nobody had ever mapped that. And it shows that somebody had come up that jungle river, the Amazon, because the Amazon River is mapped for so many miles. It had never been mapped. So that you do not find, in the Columbus period, you do not find that kind of mapping. You do not find those places mapped at all. In fact, you do have about 100 years or so after Columbus, you may find one or two things, but they do not come even close in terms of their accuracy and sophistication.
The belief is that, you know, people just came to the continent and we didn't go anywhere. We just sat there, okay? And so it was very difficult to get people to take a look at what Ivan van Sertima and other people have said and written. And I cannot say right now that everybody believes it, but we did get agreement on the fact that they are going to look for ways of showing that in the curriculum so that people understand that Africans have been around the world, and they did it prior to Columbus. Would you believe that?
The next major wave of migration from Africa probably took place around the 6th century AD. At this time, Persia's Cambyses began to destroy everything in his path, including the 3,000-year cultural reign of Egypt. People and priests scattered. Buddhism, Taoism, and the followers of Confucius also all started around this time. If so, it would explain why Buddhism took a strong hold in India, a place where blacks had lived for centuries.
So, for example, in India today, you have 160 million black people with straight hair.
But all the regular, what we call Afro-Asian.
I've seen the blackest people I've ever seen in India.
Really?
I mean, black people. Black people who were so black, I couldn't, one old man I saw, I couldn't take my eyes off. He must have thought there was something wrong with me because I kept staring at this brother because I'd never seen a person that black, that beautiful before. I mean, just a shiny black with gray hair, magnificent.
But there's actually no place in the world you can travel and not find indigenous African populations. The Negritos of the South Seas. We've already talked about the Olmecs of Mexico. Even when Viking Eric the Red went to Iceland, he found Africans. We explained how Africans transported elephants to China as part of a 2,000-year trading partnership these two groups enjoyed. Africans are also described in places visited by ancient Greeks. They're even in Siberia and among the islands of Fiji and Samoa.
And the people of West Africa obviously were the Africans who came to the New World.
Of West Africa?
Of West Africa.
Tell me who they were and how they got here.
These were the people from what Mali obviously stretched closer to the sea. Now, Harold Lawrence, who named Kofi Wangara, has done something on this in a book called African Explorers in the New World.
Those are the African people who have left descendants. Then there are other groups with African names who may have also existed, but no longer have descendants.
When we talk about culture, when we talk about the historicity of Saudi Arabia, you're telling me that there were several original cultures. Who were these people? What do we know about them?
Correct. What people don't realize about Saudi Arabia is besides we have several cultures. We have Nabatean cultures. We have villages that we discovered in Al-Fao to the south of Saudi Arabia. The most prominent of the pre-Islamic civilizations in Saudi Arabia were the Nabateans. And most people don't know who these people are in looking at us from the West. But everybody knows, for instance, what Petra and Jerash is. The Nabateans are the same people. They controlled the spice routes and the trade routes inside the peninsula, and especially along the Red Sea coast. And one distinctive characteristic they have is that they built their villages in rock formations. And in Saudi Arabia, we have several of those that have been very beautifully preserved. And for instance, where we stand now would be very similar to what you would find in Madain Saleh or in Al-Fao to the south. Those cultures existed or were thriving in Saudi Arabia between 3000 BC all the way to approximately 1000 BC. One interesting characteristic about Saudi Arabia, especially in its relationship with Africa geographically, is you find very similar characteristics, let's say traditions that exist on one side of the Red Sea with those that exist on the other side of the Red Sea.
For example?
The traditions of the fishermen in Tehama, which is the southern part of Saudi Arabia along the Red Sea, are very similar to those of the Sudanese fishermen and the Ethiopian fishermen. Even a lot of the racial characteristics of the East Africans are very similar to some of the people in Tehama in Saudi Arabia. And Tehama again extends from the southern end of Saudi Arabia into Yemen, and it's essentially the coastal plain. Their diets are very similar, their architecture is very similar, and so forth.
Before it was called Ghana, there were people living in that area called the Garamantes, and we meet them in Herodotus' work because he mentions them as Africans who went to war using a three-wheeled chariot. Herodotus was wrong. Coming from Europe, he think everything that moved is a weapon of war. It was a utility wagon that they used to bring farm products in from the field.
Today, when we say the word Ghana, we think of modern-day Ghana.
Well, no part of modern-day Ghana was any part of the geography of ancient Ghana. And yet the name of modern Ghana is legitimate because the population of modern Ghana originally migrated from the area of ancient Ghana.
Of course, migrations took place on the African continent also. After the fall of Kemet, other African civilizations sprung up. In part 5 of this series, we talked about the kingdoms of Malai, Ghana, and Songhai. But we did not discuss the builders of these magnificent ruins in Zimbabwe, the greatness of old Tanzania, or the kingdom of the Ashanti, an African principality the British could not subdue until neighboring African kingdoms joined the fight. And as always, to really understand the topic, which is African migration, you have to take the time to highlight specific African kings.
We got to deal with Songhai. What happened to Songhai?
Okay.
What happened to Songhai after the death of Soni Ali, 1492, the coming to power of Muhammad Abubakar Ituri, 1493, and when he came to power, he's a commoner now. He had to dispose the weak son of Soni Ali. And on his way to his inauguration, the sister of the son said, "Say it is not he. Say he has not done this to my brother." And she called him throne stealer, usurper, thief, ashler. And he stopped and said, "I will not let the mournings of this weak woman disturb me. Henceforth, this is the name of my dynasty. Call me usurper, thief, throne stealer. Call me Ashler."
In other words,
he created the Ashler dynasty, and he is known in history as Ashler the Great, Muhammad Ashler the Great. He instituted certain reforms that are still being used today.
Such as?
The classification of people in the army based on what they were best suited to do. He found a naval a fleet that can move from the water to the land. He's the forerunner of what we now know as amphibian warfare. He found the basic classification now used in the army. All of this was studied by the Germans, who made a strong study of African military techniques. It was studied by the Germans, and America picked it up from the Germans.
Right.
They knew about all of this when they were saying we had no history. They knew about our history.
In part 5 of this series, we also showed you pre-European West African written languages and their similarity to the hieroglyphs of Kemet. If similarity in writing exists, it stands to reason West and North Africans had the same advanced means of travel the East Africans had. And that means Africans sailed the Mediterranean on into Europe.
There's a strong possibility there was a blackness in the Irish, and there was a black dynasty in Hawaii. LeGrand Craig has done some work on that, and there was a a black strain in the Philippines, and there was some black emperors of China. We quite forget that prejudice based solely on color is comparatively new.
500 years old, you say?
Approximately, but prejudice based on religion and culture is as old as man.
The writings of historian J.A. Rogers confirm this, and British archaeologist David McRitchie documents as late as the 10th century 3 all-black provinces existing in Scotland. He also labels King Alban of the 10th century, also known as Kenneth or Dubna, a black man. Welsh tradition says in 1631 a black pirate named Ali Crusa attacked and carried off the daughter of Sir Finan O'Driscoll. But not all Africans came to Europe as raiders. Some came as conquerors.
We'll call that the royal wave of African migration. And to discuss this migration, we have to specifically talk about the Moors and the Berbers. There are no two people more qualified to discuss those topics than Dr. Ivan van Sertima and Dr. John Henry Clark. Who then were the Moors, and why did the Portuguese and Spanish hate them so much?
Well, the Moors controlled Spain and Portugal, but the Portuguese freed themselves from the domination in 1240. They hated them because they were foreigners who were ruling over them.
Were the Moors Arab or black?
They were a mixture, but mainly black. The word Moor came into the language meaning blackamoor.
Ah.
And when the English speak of marshlands or dark places, they speak of it today as the Moors.
In other words, the negative connotation came from domination.
Yes.
Okay.
But the Moors introduced a lot of things into Spain. They gave Spain the greatest material culture it ever had before.
Were the Moors basically out of that Moroccan area, or were they from
No,
further
they're
south?
out of the Senegambia area and out of the area now marked on the map as Mauritania.
Okay.
And they were descended. The black, and Halle Bourguiba's book on the Moors and on the conquest, she says the army was as black as ink. The general was blacker still. What made the general seem to be blacker than the rest? He was the only one riding a white horse.
On the edge of the Industrial Revolution, when Europe had been in a dark age, came the Moors. Who were these Moors? They're a mixed bag, yes. They were not all black African, but of the 7,000 troops that attacked Europe, 6,000 were black Africans. They included Berbers. They're both blue-eyed Berbers as well as black Berbers. The Smiths among the Berbers are all black, the metal workers. The people who were involved in metal smelting are the black Berbers.
And their reign in Spain and Portugal lasted until a surrender. Besides physical description, we have other clues that the Moors were black, most of them verbal.
The Romans and Greeks gave surnames to people to either describe how they looked or to explain their place of birth. To the Romans and Greeks, then, the words Niger and Fuscus both meant dark-skinned. Another word, Afer, meant from Africa. Moor has its roots in the Greek word moros, which means black, and then there's also the Roman word moros, which also means black. The Greeks also used the word Ethiops to describe black people, and that became synonymous with the word Moor.
The Latin word for black is Afer. Moros is probably an African word. From it we get surnames such as Moore, Morrison, Murray, Tanamore, as in Tawny Moore, Mauer, Moro. You get the drift. Anybody with a Moor sound in their name more than likely had African ancestry at some point in time. The word Niger also denotes African ancestry and has probably become one of the most misused words in African history. The writer Claudian describes as Moors those who lived next to the waters of Jur, which he said overflowed its banks like the Nile. From that, many blacks of antiquity came to be called Niger, later Niger or Nigritia. It's a word in any form that describes heritage and antiquity, no matter how it's pronounced. You can see the same heritage in the word blackamoor. It was something that inspired pride in many European families, so much so that literally thousands have the word Moor, Maurice, Fitzmaurice, or, in German, Schwarz, black, in their family crest. In fact, in the Romance of Morian, a King Arthur legend, Sir Morian was described as all black, his head, his body, his hands, all black, saving his teeth. And to quote, "Moors are black as burnt brands, but in all that man would praise in a knight, he was fair after his kind. In him was not unsightly. He was taller than any other knight by half a foot." End of quote. Many of the Moors settled in Germany after their expulsion from Spain and Portugal. Many married into German royalty, which may explain why this woman, Charlotte of Mecklenburg, shows an obvious African heritage. Charlotte was Queen of England from 1744 to 1818, married to George III.
The words, the crests, the migrations, the conquerors are all incredible contributions to human history. We don't know about them because they're usually not taught in our schools. But that's changing. To help that change take place more quickly, we also need to document the 2,000-year assault on African history and African heritage. We'll do that in the next edition of African American Culture, A Second Look. I'm Marty Chitwood.
You cannot consciously oppress a consciously historical people.
Major history is never truly lost. History is only lost when we lose it. If we allow ourselves to forget, then it is truly lost. Nothing is lost that is contained in consciousness, and even in the ground. When we had thought that we had forgotten it all, that it was truly lost, we find that the shattered world of Africa can be pieced together again.
The 1910 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica.
The Negro would appear to stand on a lower evolutionary plane than the white man and to be more closely related to the highest anthropoids. The characteristics are length of arms, a heavy, massive cranium with large arches, flat nose depressed at the base. In one characteristic, the texture of hair, the white man stands in closer relation to the apes than does the Negro.
British historian Arnold Toynbee, author of A Study of History, 1934.
It will be seen when we classify mankind by color. The only race that has not made a creative contribution to any civilization is the black race.
Albert Schweitzer, 1961.
With regard to the Negro, I am your brother, but your elder brother.
But you have to understand, these three men didn't hold isolated opinions. This quote, questioning the need to increase the sons of Africa by planting them in America, comes from one of the fathers of our country, Benjamin Franklin. We all know that another founding father, Thomas Jefferson, owned slaves, but he put his feelings about those slaves in writing when he voices his suspicions that blacks are inferior to whites in the endowments of body and mind. Unlike Franklin, Jefferson also had a low opinion of Native Americans, claiming they were weak with no family ties. And Abraham Lincoln may have issued the Emancipation Proclamation, but not for reasons of equality. He says while the two races do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And he says he, as much as any other man, is in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race.
Comments such as those have taken place during our lifetime, the lifetime of our parents, and at the very most, the lifetime of our grandparents. It's these type of disparaging remarks that those of African descent have to make a rebuttal against.